My book is supposed to be what I call the Black Sabbath of mathematics. The punk rock mathematics. Like, we have the establishment mathematics, which are like the sort of mainstream way of doing things. We don't have punk rock mathematics yet.
That is Abbas Jaffary. I'm Amy Guth, and this is Unconventional, the podcast about people who are doing things very much their own way. All right, so this podcast is all about unconventional choices and unconventional ideas. And today I'm so pleased to welcome Abbas Jaffary to the podcast to talk about super unconventional thinking about math. Yeah, math. I flinched a little bit too when I first heard this theory, but Abbas has the idea that the way that we frame and teach math is actually what makes people think that they hate it and what prevents more girls and women from entering and staying in the STEM fields. All right, that's a lot that we have just bitten off. Abbas, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So talk to me, what's the deal with math? What's the problem with it as it is taught and as it exists today?
Oh, okay. There are so many layers to this. Let me first start with what we know is there are a lot of gatekeeping, obstacles throughout the whole, at every level. I mean, even as young as grade school. But we do see sort of a drop off from young girls being more interested in mathematics, thinking that they're capable of mathematics, even through elementary school. When you get to junior high, you'll see that, just from my experience working with students for the last 20 years, the distribution of people that are really interested in the subject is not quite 50-50. And then going into high school, it seems to be even more desperate. For example, I tutored a couple of young ladies a number of years ago. They were straight up honors, really, really bright. I mean, they were 14, 15 years old and just sharp as a razor. I was like, oh, wow, I have such hope for humanity. And I'm tutoring them. They're both, I think, a couple of years ahead. So one of them was a freshman in a Algebra 2 honors course, which is about 2 years ahead of usual, and was getting it, doing real well, A in the class, and literally said to me, wow, I didn't really think I understood this stuff, but okay, I guess I'm okay at it. And then very recently, I had a girl who just turned 9. I've been tutoring her since she was 8. And we're working through some lessons, and a few lessons into it, she was like, I thought I wasn't good at math, but now I realize I am good at math. And her mother, who was a computer science teacher, was just ecstatic. And, we talked afterwards and she was just ecstatic. And I go, these attitudes are starting from a very young age, and then they just pervade throughout. For example, you can look up, there's an organization called Girls Who Code, and there are a lot of other separate organizations. There's Black Girls Code, there's Latinx Girls Code. There are many different organizations that are catering specifically to young women because, and those stats are, I think the surveys will show around 8, 9 years old, young girls will show really big affinity for tech and want to be involved in it and like it. And as you get into the teenage years, that is a huge drop off. It drops off to around 20 or 30% of people surveyed that are still interested by age 16. So these programs are targeted specifically to young women. And they're really brilliant how they've reformatted the entire presentation of the topic and the way that they do the lesson plans to the very materials they use. They're really reformulating just the way the subject is presented. And in mathematics, that hasn't happened. We are still teaching mathematics. In my opinion, it is very much this sort of 19th century old boys club. The topic has not evolved in the elementary teaching in several decades. And I know this from going through the curriculum 3 decades ago, and I'm still teaching the same outline right now. I'm tutoring and teaching the same things. And so when I bring it to people, I start clearing we're going to redo this from the ground up. And if I may, I'd like to say that there's 2 main problems I see. One is a logical issue, is when you limit the ability of people to enter the subject and you have a very small, narrow group of people with similar backgrounds, that stifles your thinking. I believe there are studies that have been shown like a greater diversity does lend itself to a wider net for problem solving and progress. I mean, I think in genetic biodiversity, the universe tells us it's a better thing to have. So logically speaking, if the more people you shut out of that decision process, the more participation, you're going to have, less optimal results. Okay, and even if you just want to debate that, and that's fine, you can debate saying, hey, listen, as long as the people are making the right decisions, it really doesn't matter who is involved. And, I don't agree with that, but there's people that can make a case on logical grounds. At the end of the day, the decisions that are being made, as long as they're equitable, who cares? All right, fair enough. Then let's go to the art aspect. I go, if just from an artistic, and I consider mathematics an art form. So if you're limiting the people that can participate just for the enjoyment in the art form and really just participate in how you can grow yourself and how you can use it as a language to express what you're thinking. And if you're just limiting people on participating on that from a humanitarian perspective, I think that's a problem as well. So there are multiple fronts by which we can attack this problem.
Man, I just took a whole lot of notes because there's a lot of stuff I want to jump back to. I want to jump back to the idea, though, of where are girls getting the idea? Is this just socialization that we just start to kind of subtly put this idea forth that like girls do creative things and boys do the sciences and the maths? Is it like in our language somewhere, or where do we start doing that?
I think it's enculturation. We tend to associate younger mathematics with a lot of computation and say computers, and then we get into motion and a lot of building and sports and things involving physics and stuff that boys tend to be a little more rowdy and they like to play and they have this like they like to throw balls around and run and catch them and build things. And it seems like we've catered toys and cartoons to that, right? Whereas with young girls, we tell them to, play with unicorns and cook things and so on and so forth, which, by the way, there's a lot that I can show you some mathematics papers about cake baking and bread baking, which are brilliant, but they don't involve that in the problem sets when kids are young. They're showing kids doing basic things. And then as we go along, the teachers tend to themselves think that this is sort of a realm that, the younger mathematics is going to gear people towards primarily engineering tracks. And when you look around engineering, whether it's hardware or software, that ends up being a boys' club. And that is, I have a friend who she's a project manager at a software company. She will tell you she has worked tirelessly to, provide scholarships and sort of increase that space for, and she has a hard time keeping young interns, younger women who enter as junior engineers, because it's just the environment doesn't seem inclusive to them. So it is really this direct line from what we're doing at the collegiate professional level and who we're grooming to enter those fields. And that just finds its way into the textbooks and finds its way into the culture of how we present this stuff to boys and girls.
That absolutely makes sense. And I think another drop off happens is that we, like you mentioned, girls coding. I think we've done a good job of getting a lot of programs in front of girls to learn how to code. And there's been a lot of conversation about getting girls in STEM fields and things like that. I think another drop off point is we then get girls and women into the workforce and they're kind of shoved off a cliff. Like there's not this, and also you might encounter monstrously bad sexism once you get into the workplace. I think there's that piece too, where, I'd be interested to maybe look at what happens, like what the drop off rate is of women who are hired in tech at an entry level out of college and then are like, you know what, peace out. This is too much and this isn't worth it. I'd be very curious about that.
Yeah, I actually looked up a group. I just was literally looking for places to work more recently. I was like, let me try to find women-led tech companies. So there was a nice list on Forbes about like 50 different companies. And I'm like, this is great, but 50 companies out of how many companies? I mean, I'm glad we have this list, but honestly, this is not progress. This is just great. Here's a place to start. So I did find, and then there was actually a number of people around Chicago. So I was like, oh, great, I'm going to follow this person, follow this person. And a lot of leaders in that field are sort of towing that dual role where they feel that they have to be this spokesperson to say, we have to be the people that are creating the space and pointing out that this disparity exists. We can't just run our company and be CEOs. We have to be agents of social change as well. And any marginalized groups you speak to, they are always doing this dual role, whether they want to or not. Several trans mathematicians that I follow on Twitter are always like, hey, listen, I don't want to become an expert in, critical gender theory or critical race theory for people that are minority mathematicians, but I have to in order to justify my existence in this space. I mean, it is not like this theoretical idea. You are seeing it from the get-go from people dealing with just those kinds of racist, sexist, misogynist, any sort of comments like that. So, and that also, to that end, when you're trying to deal with that kind of labor as a student or as an employee or as a PhD candidate or whomever, or even as a young child, right? Like there's no way you can't do the same amount of labor. Like it's going to take energy from you. So like, how are you supposed to perform with somebody who doesn't have to worry about fitting in or justifying why they belong somewhere. So there is also that's another aspect that finds its way into who excels and how the curriculum sort of makes people feel excluded.
Yeah, so I want to go back to that, the curriculum part. I'm so interested in like the piece of what you said was that it hasn't evolved. The way it's taught has not evolved in a very long time, and it's due a reformation. What specifically needs to change about the way we teach math?
So everything you're doing up through 12th grade is sort of geared towards taking a calculus course. And everything sort of says, okay, we're going to learn some basic arithmetic. We're going to learn some basic geometry. We're going to learn a little bit of basic algebra. We're going to see how to merge those two on a coordinate plane and then plot some things and look at, graphs of things. And then you spend a few years doing what's called pre-calculus, which is just kind of rote, like, yes, you learn some algebra along the way, but it's really this sort of rote body of knowledge about what is a cosine and a sine and all these identities and these little algebraic sorcery tricks just to get an equation to sort of work out. And then you take a calculus course, which modern entry-level calculus courses are 90% pre-calculus algebra and about 10% calculus. And then from there, you can go through you can go to the engineering tracks. You take whatever differential equations courses you need, and then you can take some advanced, quote, advanced courses to do any sort of engineering if you need to. What's left out of it is introduced very, very young. The sort of number theory, the oldest branch of mathematics is number theory, where you're just exploring numbers to see what they do. There's some very, very basic questions about numbers that are still unanswered, and they're very difficult. For example, the distribution of the prime numbers and what are prime numbers, and is there any sort of pattern to them? The general consensus is no, but we can't answer that. The Goldbach conjecture, I think it's basically every positive number being the sum of at most 2 primes, I believe, or 3 primes. I'm sorry, mathematicians, but
all the hate mail comes in.
all these accounts. But if you look up the Goldbach conjecture, It's a very simple question to ask. And we still cannot definitively prove it. So there are a lot of very, very simple questions just about playing around with numbers. And why would we do this? Well, let's go back a few thousand years when your pixels on your screen were up in the sky and you're looking at these cool constellations and pictures you can make. And then you're wondering why these things are moving around on the screen. And then you might want to conjecture about some mathematics that makes them move around. Or you have a square grid of numbers and you want to make the numbers add up to the same thing. So just interesting puzzles and games you can play when you don't have streaming media and devices to occupy you. So, and that seems to captivate the imaginations of children pretty nicely when they're young. It's a nice way to instruct, saying, hey, these numbers can do this, and they get this sort of nice feeling of accomplishment from it, like, oh, I made these numbers do this, and once I have an appreciation of what this number is, the fact that these numbers produced this number, they love it. It's just from my experience, like if they enjoy the subject in any way, it gives them a sense of like, oh, okay, I am understanding how this system works. And that is sort of pushed to the wayside all the way through college, all the way through high school. And it really only picks up steam again in college if you start taking abstract algebra or number theory or courses that are basically assigned after calculus. And by that point, there's a lot of really basic stuff that you kind of need to know to be able to sort of get into those courses and just keep up with them. And if you haven't picked up those skills on your own, you're really struggling to keep up. And a lot of the kids that are excelling are doing those things on their own outside of traditional schools. And part of that is, they're not really teaching teachers how to do number theory, they're just, teachers are doing the best they can to sort of keep up with the tools they have. But the curriculum is just very narrow and it limits people into this sort of track, and it avoids many, many, many other aspects of mathematics. And there are schools that are, on their own trying to involve these things, but it's really not as coherent a picture as the sort of calculus engineering track, if you will.
It's almost like the philosophical end of it gets lost early on, and you go to just here, recite these numbers, learn how to do this equation, move on. And then if you can capture that, then you get to go back to the philosophical part in a college level course.
100%. That was my experience. And I left, just FYI, like I got sick of this stuff and I quit school at 18. I was like, I'm not doing math ever again. I don't know what I'm doing with this stuff. And then several years later, I got brought back into it by reading a bunch of popular physics books about string theory and quantum physics. And I go, oh, okay, now I have some context for this. So when I went back, then I went over to what I call the dark side of math, the pure side, where I was like, oh, I like this a lot more. The proofs and the logic. And I was like, this is, whoa, where has all this stuff been? And yeah, even some former students I had that went on to become math teachers. One of them, I taught her, she took my calculus 1, 2, and 3 tracks. And then as she was finishing her degree, I was just, she asked me for a little bit of help on some abstract algebra and stuff. And she's doing some problem sets where, yes, I mean, they're not easy, but she was like, why didn't they teach us this in 6th grade? And this is literally her as a senior in college. Because I was like, yeah, they could have things about permutation groups and whatnot. You don't need to get into the whole, yes, every group is isomorphic to a group of permutations and, Cayley's theorem. And you don't need to get into that necessarily, but you can let kids mess around with, little permutation matrices and just juggling numbers around, which I have done for younger groups. And that stuff, yeah, it's not really in the mainstream curriculum anywhere.
That's so interesting. And that's what you're referring to when you're talking about kind of the art form of it.
Yeah, in fact, the abstract algebra, the Gallian textbook that I took, when he teaches the idea of symmetry groups and dihedral groups, I mean, he's using a lot of companies' logos to show you, here's a Mercedes-Benz logo, here's this company's logo, and they're just built on this nice, 3-fold, 5-fold symmetry. And a lot of graphic designers study these things. A former roommate of mine, right? She did a math minor and she was a graphic designer. And she gave me this book. It was this really fun book on, the geometry. It had, of course, had a lot of the Fibonacci rectangle and showed you in all these different graphic design aspects, architectural aspects, as we know, like where the Fibonacci ratios show up. And that's one of them. But, these sort of the idea of like these nice symmetric polygons and symmetric polyhedra and why they're used in creating these nice logos and design and how they're also functional. And that's just one. Then you have fractal geometry. You have many, many other aspects that can just be explored for the visual beauty, but for the algebraic beauty of it. And just as a puzzle, as a logic puzzle, you don't necessarily need to apply this to anything. And in fact, pure number theorists often scoff at any practical application. They don't want anything they do ever to be applied to the real world. They just want to study numbers for the sake of numbers themselves. And on that note, we've gotten to the point where we have, I was reading some papers recently, this is in the last few decades, people are trying to study quantum cosmology, and they're saying, look, we don't have an accurate mathematical model for what's going on at the beginning of the universe. Some people are suggesting that the beginnings of the universe itself really exhibits properties of just a pure number field, if you will, and something about the distribution of the way numbers are thought about. And as far as I'll go on this, if that's okay, but if you are curious, look up the p-adic numbers and, you can read about it from there.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you said and talk a little bit about your professional journey, because you mentioned that you left for a while. And I have to imagine that when you came back to it and then later started teaching, that probably made you a much more compassionate math teacher than most.
Yeah, I mean, I was excelled at the subject and sort of went ahead a little bit and then sort of mapped out, okay, I was going to do this and this, but at that time didn't really have any idea of what the mathematics I was studying was being used for. So by the time I got to college, I was one of those kids where I was fortunate. I kind of got through high school easily with doing minimal effort. I had terrible study habits. So when I wanted to study, I'd get good grades. And if I didn't, I got much more into music at that time. And I found it much more challenging and much more interesting. And I would go out to local shows and I would meet people that were a few years older than I was. And they were writing songs and creating these works of art. And I was like, this is incredible. Like, you guys created this and I'm learning about all this music here. And I'm getting fascinated with how people are just spending so much time and energy building something from scratch. And I wasn't getting that from school. Yeah. So I put a ton of energy into understanding, okay, I have to practice. Like, I have to really, really work at this. This is teaching me things that, again, for better or worse, I didn't really have to do in school because I just got stuff. And to be fair, I mean, yes, I had to work at things. I didn't just show up. This is not a Goodwill Hunting situation. And if that happens, wonderful. But I mean, yes, I did a lot of work and as such. But anyway, after I graduated high school and I got into college and I was like, you know what, this is really boring and I can't stay awake. School is not for me. And I'm just falling asleep. I'm not keeping up and I have no idea what I'm doing with this stuff. I'm done. I don't want to ever open another math book again, because who cares if I can, compute a Taylor expansion of a sine series of such and such and such, whatever, which again, if you've done BC calculus, I know that's not a big deal, but at 18 years old, when you're studying, doing this for hours and hours a day, you feel something from that. So I got done with it. And then, yes, sort of full circle, I went music and was just sort of independent independently trying to make a magazine and doing some radio shows and traveling a lot, and formed a band, and we released our own record and all that stuff. And then as I was volunteering at the College DuPage radio station, one of the overnight DJs was reading this book and he was telling me about it. And it was about sort of like higher dimensional physics and string theory. And it was just a popular book by Michio Kaku. So I was like, oh, I kind of like that stuff. Like, so I went and got the book and I got really drawn into it, and it really gave a lot of context. I was like, oh, okay. So yeah, after I started reading a bit of this more, I had gotten a job at a tech company at that time and was like, oh, okay, so now I get it. Here is where all the kids that were in these honors math classes, they are now designing these things. And what am I doing? I'm still going home and listening to heavy metal records. Like, okay, here, So it was really fun to see this environment of like, oh, okay, now I'm seeing these boards and these circuits and these things being developed. I'm looking at these parts and these diagrams. Okay, I wish I had some exposure to this when I was a little bit younger. I don't know what prevented me from connecting those dots. So eventually I decided to go back to community college. So I took calculus and physics again. And then I was like, oh, and by the way, if you're taking calculus without taking physics, it's kind of like the bread without the butter. It's like, man, Newtonian calculus was essentially invented to do physics. So when you try to teach those two things separately, it's like, what are you doing? That should not be taught separately, but they are. We can use calculus for finance and many other things, but at the end of the day, it's all, those two things are tied together. So after I got back into school, yeah, I was like, oh, okay, I wanted to just amass a whole bunch of applications that I could bring back to a classroom and say, all right, I want to go back and I want to teach people and I want to give them concrete things that they can do with this. When they ask me, what am I ever going to use this for? And I was like, well, here you go, A, B, C, D, E. And, I still kept one of my feedback sheets one year. I had this incredible group of, they were high school seniors that had taken a semester of calculus and they had sort of tested out of it. So they were coming to the community college where I taught to take the next calculus course. And these kids were just so incredible. I mean, they worked together, and the way I did my courses is I dislike tests. I really hate tests. I understand the need for some of them, but I would do it where it was more longer take-home projects, and there would be some quizzes in class, and I always let kids sort of retake the quizzes because they're like your fundamentals. So they would get together, they would work hard, they would retake the quizzes, and then when they did their projects, I even saved some of copies of their notes and their projects because they were just so dedicated to it, and they were just really taking it in and getting as much as they could out of the course. And they all gave me really good feedback. Thankfully, the number one thing they said was real world applications. Like, wow, thanks for showing us real world applications one after another as to what we're doing with this stuff. So that was become my impetus, and I was able to take things from computer science and even right now, say epidemiology and modeling that. You could take that right now. You can take things from video games. You can take things from the ocean. You can take literally anything you look at. If you ask me about it, I will find some way to say, oh, well, this is what they're doing. And even if it's not something rudimentary, like if you ask me about topological quantum computing, I'm like, okay, well, we'll need a few layers to get you to that. But I did show a 14-year-old just the basics of quantum computing. So there are so many things out there that you can do, and you have to fish around. You have to ask people, get some experts involved, but there's just a whole world that is not even tapped into at the elementary and high school level that should be, in my opinion.
And I think more people would be a lot more excited about it. I think so many people are like, I'm so anti-math. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a newsroom and either said myself or heard someone say, hey, I picked journalism because I was told there'd be no math. Like even when you had to just like do your budget to pay your freelance writers or something. I mean, people have feelings about math because I think exactly what you're describing, because there's at no point where they like lit up about it really. So for you, when did you kind of come to this theory of like, wait, the way we're doing this is totally wrong and we have to do it a better way? Was that when you stepped away from it for a while, or was it once you started teaching or somewhere else?
Oh, yeah, definitely when I came back. And I was starting to go back to in my mid-20s, late 20s, when I went back to school to do my degree and started learning all of this stuff beyond calculus. And I'm at that point, I was like, why is this missing? This shouldn't be missing. So yeah, slowly as time went on, I would find ways to take some of those ideas and filter them into tutoring or teaching or whatever I was doing. And so again, you're still kind of constrained, but hey, people are signing up for this course. You have to teach these objectives. But thankfully I was given enough freedom to, fill the problem sets how I wanted. So I was able to sort of go out there. But even then, you're only sort of limited. And I really think at the elementary level I was teaching community college. So at the elementary level, that stuff is still not, it's getting stifled. It is not finding its way in there for a variety of reasons. And I don't know. I have no idea at the end of the day why that is. There are some authoritative bodies, some of education that somehow make these decisions, and I don't trust them at this point at all. For example, I'm right now arguing with the Illinois State Board of Education about some stupid bureaucratic thing that came up. And the response when I ask these questions directly contradict themselves. Like in this email, they say ABC, therefore we cannot do DEF. But I'm like, well, that is a total contradiction, and they're silent on the issue. So when I contact, any sort of state representatives, they're like, oh yeah, we'll look into it. Nobody gets back to you. And I'm thinking, okay, if the State Board of Education here is taking this approach where on a very simple matter that's pretty clear cut, they're just inflexible, and this is a more recent example. I'm like, this is just icing on the cake in terms of if you're approving these curriculum things that really you have your own created metrics that you're using to gauge whether people are doing well. We have statistics and we have data to show that, testing is not uniform. Certain groups of people don't perform as well on certain tests. And whether that means the test itself is biased, we don't know. I think it's a resource issue. We know that resources are non-uniform. So we're still using the same testing to check everybody, even though we know that they're not getting the same preparation. And we can tweak curriculum, we can make it more localized, we can relate it to local events, and we can get people involved. And we're not doing that. And whatever you call yourself as some sort of body of, I don't want to use the word experts because I don't think these people are experts, but this is absurd. This is stuff that could be taken care of that people are just dropping the ball on.
So where's the fix? How do you start to, that's a huge question, right? Like, because you're taking on hundreds of years of thinking on a topic and bureaucratic bodies and all that. Like, where do you start to, I shouldn't say start to move the tide, because I know that you are already moving the tide by the people you're teaching and the people you're interacting with, but where can people start to make some really big widespread change on this topic then?
You have to get away from standardized testing.
Yeah.
Standardized testing, I know that there's a purpose for it, but we're so overly dependent on it that it's quashed any sort of creativity. So you need to get away with standardized testing. You can keep it for its limited use and leave it there. But this probably gets into a bigger discussion about capitalism, because the education is a business. It's governed. It is, we are catering to textbook manufacturers and other private interests that want to sell you things. And at the end of the day, that's how decisions are being made. So we have to somehow convince people to get off of that model. And that involves lobbying Congress. And that's another realm.
Undoing the entire economic model and all that. Yeah, that's a whole thing.
But in terms of just schooling, number one, you need to give teachers freedom to teach instead of having to fixate on this set of prescribed things that they have to fit themselves into. It square peg and round hole. Yeah. Let teachers who probably found really clever ways to help themselves understand it, allow them to bring that to the classroom, and not expect all the students to learn at the same rate. So instead of having grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, you just say, here's a bunch of topics we're going to learn, and here you go. And you can spend as much time as you want learning on these things. And you can say, rather than you have a 70% because you got things wrong, just say, okay, you've completed 70% of the curriculum correctly, great. And then just leave it at that. Now, if the students are able to complete more, great, they get higher completion grades. And if they're not able to complete more, well, we can figure out what's going on and why, but they can learn things in a nonlinear way. And then we can have a teaching curriculum that shows teachers, here's a bunch of topics, here's how they fit together. Some of them, here's your prerequisites, but a lot of them just sort of overlap. And teach it as an art form. Say, this is problem solving, here's agency, here's the question, let's take your approaches, and then here's a proposed solution, and can you fit the solution into your own way? Or maybe you come up with a new solution. So instead of following this sort of linear, narrow, steps that we've created for people, they make some sense, but they're kind of arbitrary. We can just leave it as an open field and say, okay, you can jump around over here and go things out of order. And then through 6th grade, I would say there are I could tell people, these are things I think, you can get kids to master, if you want to call it that. Some may move ahead, some may take longer. Fine. It doesn't matter, so remove the stigma of whatever levels these things are at. Remove this sort of like advanced and remedial, it's ridiculous. Like, it's just, the subject is the subject. Treat it like an art form where you're not necessarily getting graded on whether you're right or wrong, but you're graded on how much you want to do.
And then what about adults that are not in academia, not necessarily doing math for a living? how can we start to like retrain our brains to think about math more, what's the word I want? Creatively, usefully, positively, constructively, all those things.
Okay, so number one is to take your own agency and say, look, if you are balancing your checkbook, if you are running a business, if whatever you're doing that involves any sort of numbers whatsoever, number one, bravo and kudos to you, because that's a lot of work. All right. So you don't want to discount it. Do not compare yourself to what anyone else is doing, and do not listen to anybody that says, oh, well, you should, just shut up. Like, just let the people, it's an art form. You're going to have a relationship with numbers. You often use, my favorite analogies are probably cooking. If you just memorize a bunch of recipes, you're not a chef. Like, that's great, but you're not really learning how to cook. So and people that they're not professional chefs, but they're brilliant, and they can cook things. And it's like, oh, wow, this was really brilliant how you figured this out. No difference, right? It's the same thing. You just say, hey, I've been messing around with these numbers and I thought about this, and this is what I came up with. And that's fantastic. And then we're starting to have some more of the popular math books come out, which are really fun. There's one author I really like named David Richeson, Richeson, and I think he's written a book called Euler's Gem, which I was like, oh, this is a really nice survey of a lot of fundamental math topics that are easily accessible to anybody. And if you wanted to sort of get acquainted with like something that's beyond high school, but at least very accessible, that's a really good book. And he's got a nice blog where some of it gets a little more technical and you might need some background, but overall, there are more books like that coming out where you can just pick up something. Don't be shy if it's like a kid's book. I just saw one Sunday at Jefferson Park out here at the market. The bookseller next to me had these really nice 2 books by, I have to look up her name, but it was just, a lot of geometry and a lot of art in math. And she went through like geometric shapes and knots and a lot of different things targeted for kids, but it was any adult could pick this book up and start drawing all these interesting diagrams and get a huge survey of several areas of mathematics. So at least it gives you an idea of what this is. The other thing is, data we can all read and appreciate, and we can all follow what data is doing. And then if you want, you can kind of dive into that a little bit and start trust your intuition on it and say, hey, my elected official is saying this, and I want to get involved in this. And if you start looking into, say, election politics, and even look at the electoral college, right? Look at the way voting systems are designed. That is something that a lot of us could run into and probably start to understand much more quickly than we might realize. And you can just become a part of that conversation right away. You can ask, where your municipalities are spending money and why they're spending money and why they won't tell you what they're spending. Why are these people getting paid such and such and such? Where did the money come from for this, right? What are the interest rates that people are getting charged, A, B, and C? Look up the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What are the projected #1 job growths? And why is it one of the top job growths wind technician? And how come so few schools have programs for wind turbine technicians? So on and so forth, right? There's a lot of areas you can start to just get your feet wet with, at least getting numbers more into your life and saying, okay, I can look at these things. And then if you want to learn more, go ahead, start back at a community college, start anywhere, take some of what they call the developmental courses, but do not worry about audit the courses, if you will, or don't worry about grades. Just worry about, okay, I see what they're doing. Is this making sense to me? Is it not making sense to me? Why? And on some level, it's going to say, oh, I just didn't understand A, B, or C. And on some level, the way that it's presented to you isn't going, it's just not good. So when you can make that distinction, you can start to pick out, oh, it's not me. It's not that I don't understand this. It is just the way that the information is being conveyed to me, which will teach you how to parse that and say, okay, I'm going to be able to find something that's going to work for me. Just like if you're trying to cook something or build something and it's funny that you mentioned journalism, because a lot of mathematics is writing, and I look at what a lot of journalists say. I'm like, they're just doing the same thing. It's just a different language. I mean, I tell people the job of mathematicians is to separate fact from opinion. I mean, just what you're doing, right? You're proving theorems, and it's like, well, this is not true, and here's logically why it's not true. And what are you doing as a journalist, right? You're just presenting information and parsing out what you can verify and what is known to be true. Yeah, so it's just a different medium.
That's interesting. Something that you said that really sticks out to me of shifting the narrative of it's not just me, because I think the way math is presented as like early ways that we touch math is like memorize your multiplication tables. Learn to add, learn long division. Like there's a right and wrong answer and that's it. And it's very black and white. So it becomes very easy to say, I'm not good at this, as opposed to this is taught in a fucked up way, or this is not being explained to me appropriately. I'm being failed in this. I know personally, it was all about middle school to me. It was like all when I had this real douchebag of a math teacher who wasn't even a math teacher. He was a coach that they just like needed someone to like run the pre-algebra class. He started commenting on, because we're young teenage girls, he starts commenting on our bodies. Like when we get up to do math problems, he's like, he's like, you and you go up and do, show your answers for these questions. But for the girls, he would go, hey, if you're going to get up there in that tight t-shirt, you're going to have to cover up. So he started like sexualizing us in front of the class. So years later, we were all like, man, I was good until that one guy's class. And then we realized, oh, because we were all being sexualized and it was super creepy. So what I did is I went to like Khan Academy, just like hopped online and it's free. And I was like, where did it drop off for me? And I just started like looking at classes. I was like, okay, I know everything in that. I know how to do that. I just started with like the most basic stuff until I was like, yeah, that's exactly, it was that right there about this like 7th grade level or 6th grade or whatever that was, this pre-algebra level. I was like, that's where it started getting intimidating, because it was not only right or wrong math, but it was, I'm also going to be a creep. I mean, he was like 24 years old and he had no business being around anybody, like most, especially not, young women hitting puberty and telling them about their bodies or anything like that. He was a creep. And I think he was later fired for something else. But my point is, if you're in this black and white thinking, it becomes very easy to like, I hate math. No, I hated my teacher. My teacher was a creep. And at no point was it ever talked about in an interpretive art form way. And I think if more people understood it that way, it would be fascinating, because that's what people say when they talk about math. They're like, I'm not a math person, I'm an art person. I'm more into the creative. But I think if people realize the connection between the two, they'd be pretty astounded. Which brings me to, I would like to talk about your zine, Mathematics for Misfits. Tell me the origin story there. And I should say, disclosure, I edited volume 1 and it's hysterically funny and raunchy in all of the right ways. So I know it really well, but tell me how it came to be for those who may not have heard of it yet.
Thank you. Mathematics for Misfits is just a collection of problems about mathematics applied to taboo subjects. So, for example, if you happen to go to a swingers club, and good on you if you do, and all the ways you can pair with people and match and all the rules, that is a combinatorial problem, right? That is just very similar as a big network, and you're traversing how to get from point A to point B along a network, which we optimize for computer science and we use in 100,000 different ways.
Right. And in that one, it's like optimizing the swingers club so you don't have any repeats.
Right, exactly. What are the rules, right? It's like, okay, how many different ways can you form 3 sums, 4 sums, 5 sums, and these are just counting subsets. That's all. It's just the same thing as like, how many subsets can you form from a collection of k objects? Or example, if you have a vampire that drinks a little bit of blood from its victim, and then the blood regenerates, and then it drains more blood, and it regenerates, and it drains more blood until eventually it runs out. That is identical to paying off a mortgage. All right, it's just the same way that a mortgage works. You pay some off, you get a little bit of interest. You make a payment, a little bit of interest comes back. It's the same thing. And there's many, many other things that I started incorporating. I had a couple of friends. I did this many years ago on the radio, where we counted how many times Satan would appear on a record, right? And we were like all right, which band is more satanic, right? Which one? So then I was like, all right. So then I found it. I was like, oh, this is data. So when I was teaching a stats class, I made up a quiz, and I had a couple of friends count several different albums and how many times the number of Satan appears on a record. So then we just turned it into a quiz about like, what's the probability that if you have a random band that claims it uses Satan X number of times, what's the probability that they're lying or telling the truth? And this it's a topic called hypothesis testing, which is the same thing that's used in, say, self-driving cars and many, many other areas of behavioral sciences and whatnot. Should the vehicle make a turn left or right, depending on how safe it is to do that? And there's a probability measure associated with the data that you have and the visual you're looking at, and then it makes the decisions. So all I did was take a lot of familiar topics and just sort of dress them up with something more morbid or sexual or whatever. All of the non-sexual content came from classes that I taught. So I did use the quiz about Satan. I used the vampire drinking blood. I did one about roller skating, and I do a lot of roller skating and roller derby. So I had a bunch of roller derby players going around. I made a model of the track, and then I had students sort of play the little animation and find moments where the skaters were colliding, and so on and so forth. So I was able to just dress these problems up to make them a little more fun. So now I've collected them into a book. I added a couple things that I had left out in the original problem sets. That's volume 1. I am now in the midst of porting it to the web and an ebook specifically. And this could be a whole nother hour of topic for accessibility purposes. Mm-hmm. So more recently, I learned how kind of behind we are on making mathematics accessible to non-sighted or any other students or people that are using assistive technology to try to read or understand mathematics. And there's some really good open source tools that are available. But for example, if you're doing it for the web and somebody's using a screen reader to read what's on the web, translating mathematical symbols isn't always uniform. It's different depending on what software you're using and what device you're using. And so people are sort of trying to find ways to make this stuff communicatable to people that are using assistive technology. And so I was like, my whole impetus is to make mathematics more open to everybody. And this is an area that needs to be addressed. So I'm in the middle of porting the book over to a web format that would be fully accessible. And once I have that template set up, I will then begin volume 2, which will involve, again, a lot of drug dealing, sex work, the terrorist food network, like just a million, like cake baking, and just many, many, many other aspects that I was like, for example, like if you're tying knots and you're trying to say you're a sex worker and you're very, very good at tying up knots and stuff like that. Okay, that's hard, like to find and how to make sure that they unravel and are certain very complicated knots, in fact, really not knotted. They're just, you can tug one thing and they come right apart. And it's like, okay, well, so, and then, just managing your services and finding out what's worth what. It's basically pricing an insurance policy is the same as pricing out your services as a sex worker. I'm like, there's a whole bunch of risk metrics involved, and it's not always uniform. For example, if you happen to experience menstruation your whole life, how much money are you spending throughout an average lifespan that people who are not menstruating are not spending, or whatever? And this was originally, this was sort of meant to be as this is years ago when I started it was sort of a dichotomy between men and women. I am working on the language now because it is a lot more complicated. So I was like, okay, I'm going to make sure that I phrase the language, consult people, and make sure that it's appropriate. But I was like, there's a lot of, for example, bra sizing, right? There was an original problem in volume 1 about when I heard people talking about getting fitted. I was like, you're talking about an algebra problem. Like every time a band size shifts, a cup size shifts, and it's not uniform, and American and European scales are totally different. And it turns out that it's a public health issue because from what I understand, most women are not sized properly. And I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to. And in fact, one of my friends has written now sort of an introduction to this about her experience and what she had to do to stop, aching and have the pain go away. So I was like, all right, well, maybe there's a fun way to draw some more attention to this and why is this still a problem? I don't understand. Like, this is so ridiculous. So there'll be a whole bunch of different topics in there. And then I hope that ecosystem can sort of inspire people to, pick up the subject. And I was fortunate enough to meet some people that literally said, oh man, I didn't like math. I wish I had you as a teacher. This is great. So they picked up the book. And if it gives people some joy, then that's the goal there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're thinking through scenarios that are easier to imagine. And some of them are hysterical, like the thing you do in volume 1 with all the swear words, of all the combination of swear words. That's really funny. And then you realize, like, wait a minute, he tricked me into doing lots of math just now. But it works, and it's like fun, and it's funny to do it, and because it disarms it in such a way.
Yeah, and this is literally when I'm doing mathematics and I'm getting upset and cursing, I go, this is how I learn. Like, I finally realized, like, I learn in this very weird way, and I have to create. And this actually started from a friend of mine that I was trying to teach, and he was doing his bachelor's degree and he just didn't want to do the stuff. And I understand it. So I started sexualizing some of these questions to make him think about A, B, and C. He's like, oh, this makes sense. And he's giggling to himself in class, taking the test.
Thinking about the sex club.
Like, yeah, because I was like, it was something. And I was like, okay, well, just whatever it gets. So he's like, but this worked for him, And I was like, okay, well, this is tapping in. And what I call it, I say it, like, my book is supposed to be what I call the Black Sabbath of mathematics, the punk rock mathematics. Like, we have the establishment mathematics, which are like the sort of mainstream way of doing things. We don't have punk rock mathematics yet. We have individuals doing things. I mean, some of the early video game people, I would say, were probably in that camp because they were finding really creative uses for what they were doing. If you look at some of the early games like Kicks and Defender and Tempest and whatnot, like, they were really sort of just taking these very basic geometric shapes and making interesting puzzles out of them. And they weren't really taken very seriously by, coders, because they were just video game. This is for kids to mess around. These are not business multi-million-dollar things. The video game industry is now the biggest industry there. And oddly speaking, it's become, the video game industry itself became this big mammoth that's sort of targeted towards young men, like blowing things up, and the creativity kind of got stifled there. So, hats off to Nintendo to trying to keep a more broad net on, inclusive gaming, and all the indie video game developers that are really building brand new things. So you have sort of punk rock video games. You don't have it for mathematics, and you can. It just there needs to be a revolution of like artists that are coming in saying, hey, this is a medium. This is mathematics. It qualifies as mathematics. And whether we use it for something or not is sort of secondary. Eventually, somebody will find a use for these things. But for the time being, get people involved so they can understand it as a language. They can understand how it's used in decision making at every level of our society. And so they can be part of that conversation. They can ask the questions and they can hold people accountable who are misusing and abusing these tools to justify policy decisions that benefit private donors and private interests instead of the public.
I feel like we need a sound effect of a mic drop right now. That was so good. What you just said, that was awesome. Well, let me ask you this. You think unconventionally about so many things in your life and the way you describe things and the way it seems anyway from the outside looking in that it seems very natural to you to think about things in unorthodox ways. Did you always think that unconventionality was like a superpower, or did it feel like a challenge or a hindrance at some point?
Thank you. That's a great question because I do wonder about this sometimes. And it seems to have clicked at a young age where, you're regarded as this weirdo because you're hyperactive and you're into computers and stupid things and you're a boy with rambunctious energy, but you're also a minority. And so I was sort of this outsider in many, many, many different aspects. I was lucky to have a sort of a close group of friends that was sort of into these quirky computer games and things, but I had such varying interests that any circle I would go into, I would always be sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out for whatever reasons, and I don't think it really sank in until high school when I had this group of friends that I thought, okay, we would go to the movies, we'd play sports, we'd do whatever. And we had a falling out, they kind of went their direction and I went my direction. And then eventually I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to become friends with whomever. I don't care what you look like and what you do. And then I started meeting people from every walk of life that I probably would not have met otherwise. And at that point I was like, okay, well, anytime I meet sort of a group of people, I have X in common with them, but I have all these other things that are not. So I can bring that stuff into this. And then eventually you would find people that are merging multiple things at once. And it was just I was like, okay, I got used to like, all right, well, this is how it's going to be. And I'm not going to apologize for what I'm doing. I'm just going to sort of do it in a positive way, present it in a positive way. The people I befriended appreciated all this oddities I would bring into the mix, but also be able to sort of, appreciate what they were doing and meld with it, So it's like part of it was survival techniques. I'm sure many people, would be able to tell you being able to sort of, meld themselves into an environment, of course, to survive, but also I was lucky enough to have people appreciate these oddities. Like, for example, I had a student recently say he had to tell his mom that his math tutor is a roller skating squirrel because he saw my Instagram video of me in my squirrel costume roller skating. And he's like telling his mom, like, this is the guy that you got to be my math tutor. But he was very happy because he's like, the math was helping him. And his mother actually ended up loving it because she also feeds squirrels. That's probably something I do feed a lot of squirrels locally.
Everybody head to the Instagram because it's a party of like the way you have befriended and gained the trust of squirrels is fascinating to me. I think it's because you gave them furniture. I really do.
Yeah, well, exactly. So and that just kind of, that grew out of what it did. So when I can merge that into, selling a math book and just have people that appreciate that, I go, all right, this is what it takes to sort of, you stand your ground, you do things, put it out there. The right people will understand. And, the haters are going to hate, and that's fine. And I could care less. And, I learned to sort of fight that and be very vicious back against it. Maybe I could cool off a little bit on that because I feel like I should be doing this emotional labor for people that are just trying to live their lives and don't want to sit there and argue with people online. I'm happy to step in and my friends will be like, why are you wasting your time arguing with trolls? I go, because somebody has to say something, Right. But anyway, and I will say, to add to this, the idea of how I learned was dropping out of school, realizing that environment didn't work. When I finally went back to school, I was like, look, I want to be going to see band A, band B, or whatever, or my friend is visiting in town. No, I want to go out. So I'm just going to take my school books with me. So I started just taking books with me. So I would read my physics books or my math homework at a concert. I would just sit there and read this and listen to them. I'm like, I don't need to watch a bunch of dudes on stage, but I want to hear them play. So I would just read, and people are like, how can you concentrate? I go, I don't know, maybe many, many years of this, it's just sort of second nature. It's background music. So here I can enjoy, I get more done at concerts and loud events where I can just have something to tune out. So I study instead of just being at home in this quiet, passive environment. I don't know why it worked that way, but it just did. So I will tell people, look, if that's not working for you, find some other way that is working for you and just trust it and say, this is what my body needs to learn. And so in some cases, it is more appropriate to be quiet and have people leave you alone. And in some cases, you need to be out in the open, and who knows? So I think the more you trust yourself, the more you allow yourself to just kind of say, this is okay, this is what I need, it will help you pursue any goal. And I would say, especially with mathematics, is we have limited people to saying you have to live your life this way. You have to give up all your freedoms. You have to study, number crunch. You have to overwork yourself. And if you don't get it, well, you're not wired for this, which is just garbage. It's like, yes, we're going to pick up things faster than others in some cases, but nobody is just purely wired for mathematics. Like Goodwill Hunting is not, I mean, it's a nice story, but it doesn't work that way. You know, there are some people I'm sure that are going to pick up some things, but it just does not work that way. People have to work really hard at it. You have to stare at these things and understand these symbols have meanings. And yes, and that is the best we have at the moment. But there are other ways to do things, and you might find your own way of doing things, and that's fantastic. And then share that with us, because I guarantee there's going to be at least multiple other people that are going to take your method of doing something and say, this makes so much more sense to me because it is an art form. And with that, you know, I think we're going to really see a lot more participation in it and a lot more critical analysis of how this has sort of shaped our environments. And I think it'll be one of the things that we can break down to sort of make things more equitable for literally everybody.
I feel like we could stand for another 2 hours, but we got to wrap. Well, thank you so much. This has been so great. I super appreciate you and your brain showing up today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.